Good morning. Today we are going to discuss what is a transaction and what are system law. Transaction is an atomic unit of work that is either completed in its entirety or not done at all. For every recovery process, yes, the system needs to keep track of when the transaction starts, terminates, and commits or aborts. We had discussed the concept of transaction in one of our earlier discussions. As I told you, the different transaction states are active state, partially committed state, failed state, and terminated state. Here, a recovery manager keeps track of the following operations. That means a transaction starting with a begin transaction. This marks the beginning of transaction execution. Then in between you have a read or write statements, and in the end you have an end transaction. This specifies that the read and write transaction operations have ended and marks the end limit of transaction execution. At this point, it may be necessary to check whether the changes introduced by the transaction can be permanently applied to the database. That can be done using a commit statement. Now, recovery manager keeps track of the following operations: commit or rollback. Commit transaction means this signals a successful end of the transaction so that any changes executed by the transaction can be safely committed to the database. That means once it is committed, you cannot abort it. And in between, you can abort or rollback. Abort or rollback means this signals that the transaction had ended unsuccessfully so that any changes or effects that the transaction may have applied to the database must be undone. Then recovery techniques use the following operators: undo, that means similar to rollback except that it applies to a single operation rather than to a whole transaction. Redo means this specifies that the certain transaction operations must be redone to ensure that all the operations of a committed transaction have been applied successfully to the database. So this is the state transition diagram for the transaction execution. That means it is starting with begin transaction, and when it is active, read and write operations are done, and at the end of the transaction it enters a partially committed state, and once it is committed, that means that can be terminated, or in between you can abort at any point in time. From active state you can abort. From partially committed state also you can abort, and if you are aborting, then it will enter a failed state, and from that point it can be terminated. Transaction. So a system log, you have to keep a system log. That means it is a log or journal. The log keeps track of all transaction operations that affect the values of database items. This information may be needed to permit recovery from transaction failures. If you have to recover the previous data, what are the operations you have done, that has to be recorded. That is in a log. The log is kept on disk, so it is not affected by any type of failure except disk or catastrophic failure. In addition, the log is periodically backed up to archival storage to guard against such catastrophic failures. That means each and every transaction that is done on a database has to be recorded in a log or journal, system log or journal. That means after periodically that will be copied to disk, and that will be you have to keep those disks. In addition, the log is periodically backed up to archival storage to guard against such catastrophic failures. If there is any catastrophic failure or disk failure, or if any crash or something happens, then you can take this log and you can revert back to your previous consistent state. Then system log. T in the following discussion refers to transaction ID that is generally generated automatically by the system and is used to identify each transaction. That means a transaction ID should be there for each transaction. Then in the log you have records like start transaction T. That means record that the transaction T has started execution. Write item T X old value new value means this is the operation is a write item and old value of the item and new value of the variable is record of that item X is stored in old value and new value, and the item you are referring is X and T is the transaction ID. Read item TX means records that the transaction T has read the value of data item X. And commit T means records that transaction T has completed successfully and affirms that its effect can be committed to the database. That means after completing, once it is committed, that means permanently that will be recorded in the database. Abort T means records that the transaction T has been aborted. Protocols for recovery that avoid cascading rollbacks do not require that read operations be written to the system log, whereas other protocols require these entries for recovery. That means if you are using cascading rollback, there is no need to have read operations in the system log, but other protocols require these entries for recovery. Strict protocols require simpler write entries that do not require new value. Then recovery using log reports. How you can recover data using log reports. If the system crashes, we can recover to a consistent database state by examining the log and using one of the following techniques prescribed. Because the log contains a record of every write transaction that changes the value of some database item, it is possible to undo the effect of these write operations of a transaction T by tracing backward through the log and resetting all items changed by write operation of T to their old values. That means in your log, if it is a write item, if you have a write item, then the value of the entry, old value as well as new value of the data is available. Then using this you can find the old value as well as new value, and you can go back to the previous consistent state. We can also redo the effect of write operations of a transaction by tracing forward through the log and setting all items changed by the write operation of T to their new values. That means either you can undo all the operation to its previous state, or from a consistent state you can redo all the operations so that it will enter a consistent or reliable state. Then commit point of a transaction. Definition of a commit point. A transaction T reaches its commit point when all its operations that access the database have been executed successfully and the effect of all transaction operations on the database has been recorded in the log. Beyond the commit point, the transaction is said to be committed and its effect is assumed to be permanently recorded in the database. The transaction then writes in an entry commit T into the log. That means commit point of transaction means if you have a transaction and all the read and write operations of that transaction is completed, then then you can commit it. Commit it means if you have successfully committed that transaction, then there is no that means that is permanently recorded in the database. That means after that you cannot roll back. Rollback of transaction needed for transactions that have a start transaction T entry into the log but no commit entry. If you don't have any commit entry into your log, then you have to roll back. Then commit point of a transaction, redoing transaction that have written their committed in the log must also have recorded all their write operations in the log, otherwise they would not be committed. So their effect on the database can be read from the log entries. At the time of system crash, only the log entries that have been written back to disk are considered to be considered in the recovery process because the contents of main memory may be lost. Force writing in log: before a transaction reaches its commit point, any portion of the log that has not been written to the disk yet must now be written to the disk. This process is called force writing the log file before committing a transaction.